Welcome to a new episode with Mark Tech. I apologize for being a little bit away for a while. I've been a little bit sick, still a tiny bit, but my voice is much better, which is obviously the most important part when it comes to doing what is essentially a podcast. I still don't know what exactly I'm doing here. But yeah, I am back, and actually, there are quite a lot of news that basically surround Apple. Again, we are not an Apple exclusive channel. We've talked about consoles in the past, competitive processors, smartphones, just everything new in the world of tech. We do cover like Samsung's foldables, basically anything that is of interest to me or anything that I believe is of interest to a wider like tech, let's call it fan base, right? It doesn't mean that you're a fan of every tech out there, but you might be interested in anything that is reasonably new. And for now, I believe the prime candidate for that is AMD Zen 5. Now, it's important that when we are talking about Zen 5, there are obviously different devices built on that architecture, or to be more precise, different processors. So we have previously talked about the Ryzen AI 300 series, which is also called Strix Point. Yeah, not Strix Halo. The naming can be quite confusing. And basically, the entire point of that was that it was a system on a chip designed for laptops, handhelds, like lower power devices. It has a decent integrated GPU. Basically, it's much more of a competitor to Apple's like M4, M3, M3 Pro chips. And now we are talking about AMD's desktop chips, which ironically all have fewer cores than the mobile Strix Point part that we have talked about, because Strix Point consisted of 4 Zen 5 cores and 8 more efficient, smaller, but also less performant Zen 5C cores. And now we are talking about the AMD Ryzen 7 9700X and the Ryzen 5 9600X, which are 8 and 6 core parts respectively. What's also interesting about them, of course, is that they are very much desktop focused. They are significantly more efficient than their predecessors, and they're tuned for significantly lower power consumption. So if you are in the tech, like in the market for like any kind of like desktop tower, anything that can get help you get like real productivity work done, and you were really looking for something that consumed as little power as possible, you might have previously looked at something like the Mac Studio, or like any other Mac, to be honest. And now this, I believe, thanks to them being on N4P, thanks to the Zen 5 architecture in general being a little more efficient than Zen 4, this does seem to be like a good step in that direction. Now, of course, it is still a 4 nanometer part, so while it is an upgrade over like 5 nanometer now to N4P, it's still not on the level that Apple is with N3B and now N3E for the M4 chip. Now, before we get into really, really detailed breakdowns, again, I'm not quite sure how much time I have, because I am planning to go on a longer weekend trip starting tomorrow. So I'll try to keep it relatively brief, but I, as always, want to interact with you guys, hear from what you believe is like interesting, what you agree with, what you disagree with. And before we do all of that, I just wanted to remind you again, please, if you're enjoying this content, subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And of course, be a lively commenter here. As I always say, I love me a lively live chat. I love interacting with you guys, knowing your opinions, having discussions with you. And of course, if you're really enjoying this, and if you want to support this channel directly, there you can leave a super chat or a super sticker right while I'm live. But also beyond that, of course, you can subscribe to my Patreon, or you can become a channel member here. Shout out to Louis God, who is a MarkTech Pro Max supporter over on Patreon, and shout out to Angelica and Max Maximus, who are MarkTech Pro Max tier members here on YouTube. So quite a lot of opportunities for you to support directly, but of course, just watching is very much appreciated. Just engaging. Of course, my Twitter is also open. I've been talking about all the stuff there as well. And before I get into really the tech stuff, brief shout out to Ukraine and their incursion into Russian territory in the Kursk region. I am absolutely one-sided here. Hope Ukraine has giant successes, and even if they don't, I hope that they weaken Russia there enough so they can strengthen their own position back on the Ukraine front line. So this is me shamelessly misusing this position to shout out something that I care about beyond the world of technology. I've talked about potentially opening up like a politics-focused channel maybe at some point, but for now, this is it. This brief shout out. So let's get started. So why is this interesting? Well, the 9600 and the 9700X, they are good chips. By all accounts, they continue mostly what the 7600 and the 7700X were doing, so Zen 4 parts. They're supported by the same motherboards as Zen 4 was. So that's a big, of course, advantage that AMD currently offers over Intel. They support similar DDR5 memory. Ryzen Zen 5 lets you clock your RAM a little higher than Zen 4 did, and these chips are more efficient. Now, however, why is the title of this video that AMD messed up this launch? Well, I have actually pre-downloaded 2 videos here. I will not watch them in full for, I think, both copyright reasons and also just like time constraints. And I also like, cheers, today just water. And you can basically see Hardware Unboxed is probably like my favorite PC hardware review channel. I had some issues with them in the past when it comes to Apple coverage, but they're not bad guys by any means. It's just that a lot of PC channels really have, in my opinion, an irrational hatred towards Apple for like high profit margins and like a lack of focus on DIY, right? So that Apple doesn't let you do it yourself stuff, that Apple doesn't let you, well, Apple lets you repair your devices, but they don't let you like put in any CPU in there, any RAM stick or any storage module. So greetings, I unfortunately cannot read your name, but yeah, welcome to the chat, brother or sister for that matter. And yeah, so while I do cover Apple here, if any of you ever are like interested in any kind of like PC hardware, I do know a lot about it. I watch all the videos, like read all the relevant news regarding it, watch the presentations. I just don't really cover it on this channel because it just doesn't make much sense given my audience. So you can basically see that their focus here is actually like very much on the gaming perspective of these chips. Now, I have to say, it kind of makes sense to make this focus because a 6-core CPU is like you can say that it's like a regular consumer like core amount. So if you're really doing nothing, then yeah, 6 powerful cores are pretty good. They're somewhere between the single core performance of an M3 and an M4 chip. Of course, because of desktop, they have much higher wattage. Even they are more efficient than the last generation. But yeah, for productivity, you would want like 12 cores or more, I believe, at this point in time. Or you would want to like really spend a lot of money on like a powerful GPU that handles your tasks. And at that point, you probably are spending so much money on like a Radeon 7900 XTX or an RTX 4080 or 4090, that at that point, like, what is $100 more to upgrade from like a 9700X to a 9950X or something like that? So yeah, this is why the focus here is very much on gaming, even on my part. Now, of course, some people will say, well, how dare you as like an Apple customer criticize anything Windows related when it comes to gaming? And my point is that basically, if you want to attract any kind of Apple customer away from their platform of choice, you have to offer them something that isn't on their platform, and that thing is gaming. However, if you present a new generation like Zen 5 versus Zen 4, you now have to make a case that you can still like satisfy people who also have their productivity needs met by macOS or even iPadOS for that matter, when you consider how powerful the M4 chip is now in the iPad Pro. We just got a report that the iPad Pro is currently cannibalizing a lot of iPad Air and iPad Mini sales because people just want that fantastic tandem OLED screen and the fastest processor to just keep their devices for a very long time. I personally agree. For similar consideration, I bought my M1 iPad Pro over any iPad Air out there or any iPad Mini or something like that. So this is why I'm trying to say, you still, like, even though, like, yeah, my Mac, well, it can game, and there are games that are very well optimized for it, but obviously doesn't compete in that regard quite to Windows. But if I ever wanted to switch to Windows, right, I would want the full package, right? I would want something that gives me like still the snappiness of the latest Macs, that gives me at least a glimpse of the efficiency of the latest Macs, that gives me like the ease of use of the latest Macs. And unfortunately, it seems like there's just a confounding of factors here that really put this generation down. So I'll try to balance my audio a little bit so I don't blow out your eardrums again. Wait, do they not have timestamps? I picked their videos because they're usually like some of the best ones when it comes to timestamps.
Today,
oh, Jesus. Oh, yeah. Okay. The timestamps appeared a little late. That was interesting. So basically, they give you like an architectural breakdown here. The pricing is not bad on this generation. It's a little bit cheaper than the previous one, and there is a big reduction in power. Now, TDP does not actually tell you like peak power consumption. It's a broad metric that mainly focuses on like heat dissipation. But yes, the chips run cooler, they consume less power, especially when you like align them for performance. This will be a part of what we cover here today, which is that unfortunately the default like configuration of these chips is way too conservative, eating way too little power to just make itself look really efficient, and unfortunately in that regard sometimes even underperforming the previous generation. So I have no idea what that boost clock change is, why it's such aggressively lower, but I assume that's part of the increased efficiency. And the boost clock is higher from 5.4 to 5.5 gigahertz. Everything else is pretty similar. As I said, RAM speeds are a little bit better. You have a tiny bit more cache. I don't like I believe L1 cache is the one that got improved. It doesn't matter, it's not that big of a change. And then there's some architectural differences when it comes to like branch predictions and things like that. So it should give you an IPC uplift, but we'll see how it actually performs in real life. Oh, Royzot KE, I haven't seen you in quite a while, brother, in the chat. Welcome. Maybe even Zen 5 can beat Apple M4 on single core performance. No, it cannot. I can already, well, let me spoil that for you, right? Which is, I've already prepared some Geekbench stuff here. Now, it should be noted that the 9700X that we see here does clock to 5.53 gigahertz. So technically, the highest point for Zen 5 that AMD advertises is around 5.7 gigahertz, which should be reached like by the 9950X and something like that. So basically the highest and best bin chips that AMD is then using to create 16 core parts based on 2 dies. If you compare that to Apple, now, yes, as I've always said, the default result for the M4 is a little weird because I've seen results closer to like 3800 on the M4 iPad Pro. But let's just say 3700, that already puts it at over 10% more powerful than Zen 5. And when it comes to Max, now, yes, it technically beats the M3 and the M3 Pro and the M3 Max for that matter. Now, of course, those are laptop devices, but it's very unlikely that Apple would suddenly overclock this specific chip when giving it to a Mac, like a Mac Studio or a Mac Pro. So what we are left is actually like just seeing that yes, Zen 5 does beat DM3 in single core performance here in Geekbench. Now, it does not beat it in every single core test that we have of other benchmarks, even including Cinebench. But because people like to point out always that like, oh, Geekbench is so Apple friendly and like they introduced like scalable matrix extensions just for Apple. For some reason, nobody cares that AVX2 and AVX 512 like are in there, and AMD is like specifically optimizing their chips, especially for AVX 512. So yeah, as I said, in just raw Geekbench, it seems to sit between M3 and M4. If you want to like try to downplay like scalable matrix extensions on the M4 and say that these tests are incomparable, then I'll just tell you you're an idiot, because at that point we will have to consider the differences in stuff like AVX 512 support on AMD Zen 5, especially on the desktop chips. So yeah, it's definitely powerful. I've heard people say that like its single core result is its like most impressive aspect. Now, it should be noted that it's by no means like a slam dunk like in the desktop space. Like we have seen like Intel Core i9 4900K and especially KS parts reach around 3300, maybe even 3400 points. But as I said, 5.5 gigahertz is not the maximum for Zen 5. So by the time we see 5.7 gigahertz chips, it's very likely that they will beat fully overclocked like 4900K parts. Well, fully overclocked by consumers, not talking about liquid nitrogen stuff, of course. YouTube Kulanchizi, who's always very interested in stuff when we talk about like processors and very detailed breakdowns. Welcome to the chat, brother. I missed you as well, so thank you for joining. I understand I haven't been here for quite a while, so I'm really grateful whenever you guys join, even after a small hiatus. Again, brother, your name is Asian, I'll just say, because I don't even know the language. Please write me what I should call you. But you were saying, cannot believe Zen 5 cannot beat M4 in single core performance. Yes, that is It's a little bit weak for Zen 5, not even because of Apple, because I understand that like most PC customers won't really compare that to Apple, but like we have Arrow Lake coming up, and Arrow Lake is like built on 3 nanometer. It's a brand new architecture from Intel that is so single core focused that it even gave up hyper threading. So I fully expect Arrow Lake to like at least match that, right? And also, I've also talked about these chips being desktop parts, but ones with very, very few cores. And in fact, when you look at the when you look at the 9700X, you'll find that it reaches like, oh, okay, I'll call you Green Nuclear, thank you. Is that it reaches like 16,000, 17,000 points, like in Geekbench. When you actually look at it, even with like DM4, now this is the downband version of DM4. So this is the one with 3 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. The 10 core part, which is 4 P cores and 6 E cores, reaches closer to 15,000, at least over 14,500. So now you have a part that is like designed to consume like 4 times less energy, reaching like 80% of your results, maybe like even 85% of your results. And that is obviously a big, big issue, because now the moment Apple scales up the M4 in a way that we had, of course, already seen with the M3, right, across the M3 Pro and M3 Max chips, where the M3 Max, of course, has 12 performance and 4 efficiency cores, and even like an M4 Pro would still add 2 performance cores to that. Now you're looking at results that very, very much easily beats like desktop parts designed to consume like 80, 90 watts or something like that. And those chips will like power like 14, 16-inch notebooks to be running for like 10, 12 hours. So yeah, there's a big, big still gap in like overall experience that Apple is capable of achieving because of their focus on ARM, on the latest generation nodes, on an overall efficiency focused architecture that AMD cannot provide. And we saw that with Strix points, where Ryzen AI 300 are good chips, but they're by no means like groundbreaking and matching the user experience of Apple Silicon Mac. Apple is not in the partner list of Geekbench 6, so I think the result is believable. Royost, you are correct. The one benchmark that people love to call like Apple Bench, which is hilarious, by the way, because I believe Cinebench 2024, before the release of M4, was actually more friendly towards Apple, like disproportionately in comparison to Geekbench, because Cinebench R23 was so bad that people were just like, "Oh, Cinebench doesn't favor Apple. That makes it more honest." And then the second Cinema 4D, Cinemaxon, like makes a Cinebench version that is optimized for ARM and Apple Silicon properly. Suddenly, nothing comes close to it, and yeah, that was just hilarious to me. Green Nuclear saying, "Is it true that e-cores are only good for benchmark but not for daily life tasks?" No, e-cores are actually phenomenal for daily tasks if you have an operating system that knows how to take advantage of them. The problem with e-cores on Intel's chips for a while was that Windows Thread Scheduler, basically the software inside your operating system that decides which core handles now which task and how many cores will be divided upon. Is it better to like really overclock one core, or is it better to like use 2 cores but at lower frequencies, and Intel's and Windows's thread scheduler just for years wasn't really good at it. And the problem is, if you introduce a separate set of cores with a potentially separate set of cache, and you have to move tasks between them, you end up with a lot of redundancy and a lot of inefficiency that kind of say, oh, why are you even using efficiency cores at that point, right? And but if the system is well optimized, so the system, for example, knows, well, there is like a background app install happening, and there are like photos refreshing in the background in the Photos app, downloading from iCloud, right? All that stuff that Apple knows the relevant use cases on iOS and macOS. Well, now Apple can tell its operating system, well, those tasks should go to the eCores, while the rest of the system can benefit from the super snappy, large, high performant, high clock speed, high amounts of cache performance cores. Now, you can still use efficiency cores simultaneously with P cores for productivity tasks. Those are not just like benchmarks. Some of those tasks are legitimately running like pro apps. And running them on many threads. And of course, once you build like server infrastructure, this is where threads matter a lot. And sometimes running a core at 2 gigahertz is more than enough for a server. So it would rather have an efficiency core that is as small as possible, but then a lot of them, rather than having one core that potentially can go up to 4 or 5 gigahertz. But that core is so big, it's essentially the size of 4 such efficiency cores. And even with hyper-threading, it just doesn't make up for the amount of efficiency and space loss that you get from using P-cores rather than E-cores. So E-cores are absolutely relevant. However, E-cores have to be designed well. Apple's E-cores, for example, are actually, I believe, 3 times more efficient than their closest competitor in the Android space. But what Android does, it introduces several levels of E-core. So there's a medium performance E-core, and then a low performance E-core. And obviously, the lower you push the overall performance, you now get some efficiency back simply from saying, oh, this core just clocks at 1.8 gigahertz instead of 2.8. So it just sits much more comfortably on the performance per watt curve. Even though the actual architecture is less efficient, the actual core is far less performant. So you now need more of those cores, which is less efficient design when it comes to die space utilization. It creates potential issues when it comes to cache hierarchies, because obviously the smaller you make a core, the less cache it can hold. So yeah, basically Apple's approach for now is probably the best, but it's not just the best because, oh, they just got the ratio right between P and E cores, but they actually went out of their way to create great E cores. And that's one thing where Intel is supposedly catching up with Lunar Lake and Arrow Lake, where they're Crestmont, I fully forgot at this point. Line Cove is their main performance core CPU design. I believe it's Crestmont core. I'll briefly look it up. Lunar Lake, Crestmont. Intel Cooler, according to Lunar Lake, will feature Line Cove performance cores and Skymont efficiency cores. Okay, so and supposedly these Skymont efficiency cores are much better than the previous generation. So that will actually be a very interesting competitor, because we'll get a 4+4 Intel chip, which is will be their Lunar Lake processor, and we'll have a 4+6 Apple chip. And Intel will be on N3B, Apple will be on N3E, and we'll be actually able to compare their latest architectures quite well. If we actually want an even more apples to Apple's competitor. We could actually even compare M3 to Lunar Lake, because M3 is also a 4 performance plus 4 efficiency core chip, plus it's built on the same node as Arrow Lake, which is N3B. Ferret Bank saying, just joined the stream, but it's really amazing that nothing comes close to Apple M3. AMD missed the opportunity once again after Intel's failure, just like they did after NVIDIA RTX 40 prices. Well, the problem is AMD is winning the DIY market anyway, right? So you can actually feel that some of that laziness that people have talked about when it comes to Intel, like their 14 nanometer recycling, for example, that you can see some of that with AMD. And I wouldn't even say that as much when it comes to the architecture. Zen 5 by itself doesn't seem bad. But I would say the fact that they felt the need to launch an N4P processor right now instead of waiting for N3E and potentially like clocking the chip 5% faster, benefiting from like another 7 to 8% more efficiency, and potentially using a smaller die, well, a more dense die to give you like potentially 10 cores instead of 8 cores, right? Because their 12 core parts is not like 12 cores in the way that even Apple's M3 Max is, which is 12 cores plus 4 cores actually, but their 12 cores are 2 6-core dies. So there are like some latency, some efficiency problems once you combine 2 dies like that together. I would have loved to see like a 10 or 12 core chip from AMD that is just on 1 die, plus their I/O die that is on 6 nanometer. Green Nucleus saying, thank you for the explanation, very informative. Well, thank you guys so much for tuning in. I know that I've been talking quite a lot. We now have more people joining the chat, so I do just want to remind you guys, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, sharing it out, commenting on it. I hope you're enjoying a lively live chat just as I am doing. I love interacting with you guys. I love talking nerdy with you. I love informing you. I love learning from you. And if you want to consider supporting this channel in a more direct way, please consider leaving a super chat or a super sticker right while I'm live. A small donation helps. I reinvest it right back into the channel. Or if you want to support this channel directly in the long term, you can subscribe to my Patreon or to become a channel member here on YouTube. Now, not all of that works depending on your region. So most of the time, the easiest thing is a super chat or a super sticker. Yeah, so that about brings us up to snuff with what Intel is planning, the state of Apple's chips. Now, of course, it should be noted that Apple's chips that we are talking about, M3, M4, those are full-on APUs, right? AMD does have a small GPU integrated into Green Nucleus, saying you just liked and subbed. That's very, very much appreciated, brother. That like the 9600X, the 9700X, they do have like a small GPU because on their like I/O die that is built on TSMC 6 nanometer, but it's nothing compared. It's like, I believe it's 2 compute units, and it doesn't even like use like the latest architecture. So if you like really want, like you cannot compare those chips fully, because Apple has to consider that their die also has to house GPU cores, neural engine cores. Apple has even more media accelerators because of their support for ProRes. They have like dedicated also stuff for image signaling, so the image signal processor, which of course is really great for like integrated cameras, and they have stuff that makes speakers, microphones better. So just the overall experience that Apple puts on the SoC, they're not unique, of course, in building SoCs, and AMD themselves builds SoCs, but because AMD, for example, doesn't build smartphones, so they don't have to build image signal processors. This is, for example, why laptops that have about the same camera hardware have greatly better camera quality on Qualcomm's X Elite chips than chips running a comparable Strix Point APU. CPU. And the main point is that because it's an AMD chip, it doesn't have a great image signal processor, or it might even run some of those things directly through the CPU, while Qualcomm, who of course builds chips for smartphones, where a good image signal processor is essential for good camera quality, they can use their expertise and leverage it in experience ways over something that AMD or even Intel can offer on laptop and especially on desktop. On desktop, this is where those companies just stop caring. Like unless they like sometimes they create like APUs built on their desktop chips, but most of the time their desktop chips are designed to just show off their latest CPU or separately their latest GPU, but they don't like want to combine it into one and potentially limit their market outreach. You can hear, by the way, that I'm still sick and that my voice still isn't quite there, so reward me for that. No, it's all good. I'm doing this because I'm having fun. Of course, any support is appreciated, but forgive me if I sound a little bit not quite like myself today. So this is about where we are right now. This is the 9700X, the 9600X here. You can see it doesn't clock quite as highly as the 9700X. This results in a lower single core result, however, still a decent one. And now in the multi-core result, this is where it will actually come in a little bit below the full 10-core M4. And of course, it will consume far more power than the 10-core M4. So yeah, you can see that there is just stuff left on the table. They could have made this like an 8-core part with like and I'm talking like for the money, right? Like they could have given you like 6 performance cores and like 2 efficiency cores, maybe even put those right on the IO die that is on 6 nanometer or something like that, even if that introduced more latency or something like that. But like those multi-core results, they're just not impressive anymore for a desktop chip. I know that Intel, because of high power consumption, doesn't like, even with their crazy amounts of E-cores, doesn't actually give you that great multi-core results, because just the power metrics outside of the 14900K and the 14700K, they just don't allow you to reach very high results without reaching absurd levels of power consumption. And obviously you don't want like 300 watt power consumption on an i5 part. That just doesn't make sense. So yeah, Apple is here actually where Apple has previously been very much more of the single core king. When we think of the M4, which will be powering the entire Mac lineup across this year and most of next year, this is where Apple is now coming back with a vengeance and saying, nah, your like $270 like desktop part. And I made that comparison on Twitter yesterday, where like the M4 iPad Pro, right, is $1,000 device, and that's expensive, that's for sure. But for that part, you get a CPU, a GPU, a neural engine, some storage, some RAM. Even if it's not groundbreaking, it's amounts of storage or RAM. You get several cameras. You get the image signal processor to actually get good camera quality. You get good speakers, good microphones. You get the actual brains in the device to actually make those speakers sound good and those microphones actually record good quality audio. Of course, you have that tandem OLED screen. You have like the support for potential accessories across the board. Now here, this is one chip, and while it technically can post because it has like an integrated GPU, you most likely would want to pair it with an actual GPU. And this is where you now have to consider you need a motherboard, you need a power supply, you need DDR5 RAM. And if you actually want pretty high results, you better get it at around 6,000 or preferably 6,400 megahertz, right? Of course, now now you need storage. Granted, storage is pretty cheap, even like PCIe 4.0 speeds storage. But when people talk about like, oh, Apple is like obsessed with margins or whatever, Apple is by far from the only company obsessed with margins. So, but let's return to what Hardware Unboxed was saying. Again, those chips are a little bit like the 7700X was actually great for its time, I would say. So if you like believe that this is just me shitting on AMD to like artificially elevate Apple, that is not true. I've been a fan of a lot of AMD's devices, well, designs and processors and devices powered by AMD. I use a PlayStation 5 myself almost daily. So yeah, it's just that this uplift is just not good enough.
L2 cache, 1 megabyte. Absolute max temperature.
Oh yeah,
DDR max has been set at 95 megabyte L3 cache, as was the case 1 megabyte per core with a shared 30. In total, there's 8 megabytes of L2 cache, 1 megabyte per core with a shared 32 megabyte L3 cache.
Okay, so it must be then the DL1 cache that got improved, because if L2 is the same and L3 is the same, and I definitely know that Zen 5 does have more cache than Zen 4, so this is where it must be the change. But I can briefly look that up, like no need to just guess. Zen 5 L1 cache. DL1 cache per core is increased from 64 kilobytes to 80 kilobytes per core. Yeah, I was correct. Nice. So that's a 25% increase. Let's continue. Let's test system specs. Do they test with a 4090? Sometimes,
so that means
sometimes you get like surprisingly better scaling when you like use the 7900X TX, even though the 4090 is a better GPU, of course. So you for Intel, you're using faster speed memory. That makes sense because Intel's memory control is better. For Zen 5, you're still using DDR4. I think you could have gotten that to 4000, couldn't you? But I guess most people wouldn't have like super fast DDR4 memory, because why? Especially if you're using something like the 5800X 3D, which has like 3D Vcache. So you get like quite nice bandwidth there, even with not so fast RAM. Plenty of fast power supply, fast storage with Gen 4, and the latest drivers from NVIDIA. So what do we have? Cinebench 2024. By the way, you will often see like some PC hardware websites. They will like give you like Cinebench 2015 and Cinebench R23 and Cinebench 2024, right? And they will present those as like very relevant like tests, and I'm like, no, Cinebench is based on Cinema 4D, which is an actual app. Now you can argue that that app by most normal people is accelerated through the GPU anyway, but let's say you wanted to run it through the CPU for whatever reason, right? What reason on God's green earth would you ever have to consider testing Cinebench 2015 on like the 9700X? Like just to me, it's just mind-boggling. And yeah, by the way, like Macs exist, and I'm sorry, but like, and I'll tell you why, because Cinebench 2024 M3. Let's just go with the Max part, right? Because that will be like the most comparable when it comes to actual like power consumption. Probably still lower than even the 6-core part, but yeah, so 142 from Cinebench. By the way, great way, a great compliment on Google here for just taking the graph out of the article. Now I am sure that the actual journalists hate this because now I can read this without ads or even opening up the article. But hey, I'm grateful for that. So 142 and then multi-core results of 1684. That is the 16 core part, so that's 12 performance and 4 efficiency cores. Now, the one thing you should focus here on is the single core result, because that will be the same across M3, M3 Pro, M3 Max, all different bin versions of those chips. So let's see how that looks here. Oh, you're telling me the M3 already wins against all of those devices in Cinebench. Now consider, let's even say a super conservative 10% increase on the M4. Now you're looking at well beyond 150 and more likely beyond 160. And once you consider the IPC increase, like, I don't know how much Cinebench does or doesn't benefit from certain specific architectural changes, but there's also a broader IPC uplift that goes beyond like the changes to scalable matrix extensions and other AI features. It would probably come out to 170 or something like that. Or at least like 165, right? And this is a chip that already exists. In fact, has existed since May in a 5.1 millimeter thick iPad Pro, passively cooled. And this is where we are here, where like, oh, we go from 124 to 136, the 4900K at 138. So anybody, whoever calls Geekbench, Apple Bench, but for some reason doesn't say the same about Cinebench and Royozd, you're saying Apple's P-Core is such magic. Of course, there is like considerations, for example, that Apple uses a newer Note. Apple can be even a little bit more generous in cache, usually. Not so in quite recent times, because they've been also trying to make their chips a lot bigger through other things, like introducing the 12 performance core on the M3 Max, right? So they cannot just double their cores in size. They do want to also give you more cores. But yeah, this is definitely where, like, guys, you could have just gotten even the cheapest M3 MacBook Air and ran some passive results on it. And even if it came out to around 130, at least it would have given like your audience this impression of like, oh, there are other things. And some would say, well, those are all desktop chips. That's such hogwash, because those are desktop parts because well, you built like a tower with it, but you can technically just buy a MacBook Air, put it into like a 12 South stand, connect it permanently via USB-C or HDMI to your television, and boom, now it's a desktop device, like for $1,100. So, and as I said, if you try to build out really nice towers with these parts, you will obviously spend way more than like the $270 or $360 that are MSRP. You need a motherboard, power supply, and all that other stuff.
Could mean good things for gaming, but of course we will get to that soon. Before we do that,
multi-core results, that's power consumption. Do they not have the actual result? Cinebench 2024. That's single core. Wait, what? Oh yeah, this is multi-core. That's weird. Why is this under test system specs? And multi-core results for Cinebench 2024, this is for the 8-core chip. Now they have launched their 6-core chip review, but that one is obviously like quite hamstrung. So let's go back to what we just had. 1684 on the M3 Max. So again, now obviously that is quite an expensive build, but you have to consider that when it comes to power consumption, it is closer to that 9700X than even the M3 Pro is. And now when we look at the M3 Pro, where are its results? CPU Monkey, I can actually recommend that website. It's quite good. That's Cinebench and multi-core, so that's 1059. You can, of course, feel the lack of 6 P cores. Even if you get 2 extra E cores, that's still not great, like in comparison to the Max. But yeah, here, like, you get like 15% more performance. And this is where you also see some issues with the 9700X versus the 7700X, where now you can see that it's really power limited in weird ways, because if you enable precision boost overclock or PBO, now you like, yeah, I believe that's what PBO stands for. Like, you can get significantly higher results, closer to like 1400, but for some reason that's like not the default configuration. So this is why I didn't want to make a video yesterday, because that was all like a developing story basically. This was breaking news, but then once I started watching more reviews, I saw like more benchmarks that showed like results that were like potentially like 10% higher, even maybe 12% higher, once you like not really even overclock it, but once you just enable higher power consumption. And the issue is just that the default behaviors here are just weird, in my opinion. And this is where I think that the way that Apple has managed their Apple Silicon, where you don't necessarily need to like enable anything, you need to configure any settings. They briefly tried that with the M2 Max, and they tried to introduce a high power mode. They did not do the same for the M3 generation. Obviously, they have never done something like that on laptops, where, well, beyond the M2 Max, where their main idea was like, look, if you need more battery life, you can briefly go into low power mode. But when it comes to reaching like peak speeds, we'll let the system decide otherwise. You don't need to go into a BIOS. You don't need to play with any system settings. You don't need to download any like a ASUS app for that. You get what you paid for. If you're happy with that, great. If not, that's also your prerogative as a customer. But just saying that potentially leaving 10% on the table is something that the desktop hardware market has actually shied away from for like the last 5 years. When you go back 10 or 15 years, yes, it was pretty common to find a lot of room for potential overclocking. But that over time has gone away as companies have felt more comfortable optimizing their chips for like higher power consumption, for higher clocks. That worked out pretty well, of course, because they could also market higher performance levels. But yeah, if you ever believe that like this is an experience that Apple would want you to have, where you would have to manually choose between that, no. Apple tried it once with like Apple Silicon and M3 Max, an M2 Max. They didn't do so again for M3, and even then, that difference was far, far smaller. Actually, M2 Max, high power mode, or was it high performance mode? High power mode maximizes performance intensive sustained workloads like 8K color grading, so it gives you like a tiny bit more performance, and it does work on the 14 or 16-inch MacBook Pro. It does work across the different processors, but I believe it only changes the max clock speed on the M2 Max. So correct me if I'm wrong here, though, because this is M2 Max. Some other people reported they only is clocked up to 3.7 gigahertz. Yes. So, and I've actually heard some like contradictory stuff here. So that would actually be interesting if somebody of you like has either done a lot of research into that, or maybe you have a device with that kind of system option. Maybe you could like run that like Geekbench briefly or something like that. But yeah, basically Apple, you can basically see that they don't like doing the same thing. They can give you like a high power mode, but they won't really change too much about your system. Your system was always capable of hitting its peak single core performance. Your system was always capable of hitting like its peak multi-core performance, but the high power mode might change like how quickly the system throttles down, how quickly the fans spin up, and that is much more standard industry stuff than like, oh, our default TDP is 65 watts, but our chips actually run at 88 watts. But if you actually want the highest possible performance, now the chips run at 120 watts, right? This is like that kind of like range of doubling its performance, despite technically having the same like clock ceiling in all those modes. That is just something that Apple doesn't like. I'm not saying Apple is perfect here, but knowing that most of my audience appreciates the simplicity, the lack of need for manual tuning and things like that, I just wanted to point that out. So this is a plus for these two Zen 5 chips, which is if you give them more power, they will give you more performance, but you will have to manually like think of that once you get them.
Faster than the 7.
And of course, once you consider doing that, now you have to consider like, is my cooling system sufficient? Is my power supply sufficient? Is my rig big enough? Now that a difference of even 40 watts is not that big for any given tower or like even any 500 or 600 watt power supply, but it's still something you have to consider. That's my point. So a Cinebench multi-core. And now you can see the power consumption here going down from the 7700X to the 9700X by around 25 watts. 27 to be more precise. So that's quite a nice efficiency boost, because we saw the 9700X outperform the 7700X by just a smidget in multi-core. And of course, this is overall total system power consumption. So it does include like the idle power consumption of the GPU, the motherboard, the Wi-Fi system, everything else. So the actual percentage is might be like 10% for the overall system, but it might be as much as 20-25% lower power consumption for just the CPU.
The Cinebench all-core workload. The 9700X averaged just 221 watts, which is a 27 watt saving when compared to the 7700X, and that works out to be an 11% reduction. Moving on to the 7-zip file manager testing, and we'll start with the compression results. Here, the 9700X was actually 3% slower than the 70.
Yeah, and this is why I wanted to cover this, because this is something that like we have had stagnation from Apple from like 1 year to another, at least in specific parts. Like when you think about the move from like the A7 to the A8, the CPU wasn't that much more performant. But we never had it quite like this. And you also have to consider, whenever we talk about even like a jump like what I just described from the A7 to the A8, that's a 1 year jump. That's from the iPhone 5S to the iPhone 6. The AMD Ryzen 7 7700X, in fact, if we look back in the beginning of this video, launched in September of 2022. This is launching almost 2 years later in July of 2024. In fact, it came out realistically only in August. So basically 1 year and 10 months. While with Apple, we are talking about basically exactly 1 year gaps, sometimes 18-month gaps when we are talking about like M series chips, or previously it was like AX processors. But yeah, a 2 year gap, we usually get far bigger changes from Apple. And again, I'm not saying that to overplay Apple or to downplay AMD in general. I'm just specifically saying that this generation is not a particularly impressive one. You can agree with that, you can disagree with that, but that's my opinion. Now, as I said, you can enable PBO, potentially you can even overclock it. And then get higher performance, but now much of the efficiency gains are thrown out the window. And at that point, you have to consider, well, if I do that, why wouldn't I just get a 7800X 3D at a similar price and get, for example, much better gaming performance, still a lot of efficiency, because the X3D parts are usually more efficient than their regular X counterparts. So, yeah, it's just a disappointing launch. If they had at least configured like the default TDP here to like 85 watts, so it actually ran at like 100 watts. This is 65 watts, like at least according to Linus Tech Tips, it was mostly running at like 88 watts. So yeah, all those things. And by the way, like AMD shipped it out with like DDR6000 memory. Those chips should support like 6600, 7200. So they're also limiting them when it comes to bandwidth. It's just a messed up launch. They already had to delay it by 2 weeks because of some initial issues. It's very clear that those issues haven't been perfectly resolved. And while Apple does sometimes have launch issues as well, never quite like this. And I know I'm comparing a lot to Apple, but that's kind of like the main focus on this channel. And I've been streaming for about an hour. Just want to remind you guys, if you're watching this and enjoying this, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, sharing it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And of course, keep up the lively live chat. Leave your comments. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with. What maybe you have some kind of questions that I can answer. If you really want, of course, any kind of comment you say I have answered, make it in the form of a super chat. Leave a small donation. That is very much appreciated. And if you want to support this channel in the long term, you can become a channel member here on YouTube, or a Patreon subscriber. Link for Patreon is in the description of this channel. So Cinebench power. So we already have some tests like Blender here that are about the same, I would argue. Well, I don't have to argue, but like, yes, again, you can enable PBO and likely get this closer to like the 14600K. But again, why would you need to, right? If the previous generation was fine running at 105 watts, what happened that we now need to like configure this to a 65 watt TDP? Like, I am all for efficiency, but we did have special efficiency modes on the 7000 series where you kept like 90% of your performance, but suddenly your power consumption dropped by like 25%. And especially if you're maybe building like a machine that is like built for a specific workflow, right? And you really don't need the absolute highest clock speeds. You just enable that mode. You get a machine that runs cooler, even with a desktop, of course, that exudes heat, right, from its active cooling system. That's a benefit. It consumes less energy, which is obviously good for your power bill, but it's also just good for the environment. You can get by with a much smaller cooling system potentially, so you can make either your rig smaller or you just save a few bucks on like the fan. And it's just so weird to me that you would accept a stagnation after 1 year and 10 months as the default results for most reviewers.
Than the Core i5 14600K.
Green Nuclear is saying,
interestingly,
thank you.
when running
Well,
the
you're
Corona
welcome,
10
buddy.
benchmark, we find that the 9700X is 11% faster than the 7700.
Yeah, and those are the results I think most of us expected to see, like at least small gen-to-gen gains. And again, 12900K, 14600K, somewhere around here. Probably depends on like how good like your chip sample is. You can get still more if you enable PBO.
100X. So decent uplift there. and I was really hoping that we would see a lot more of this.
There's
Moving on to Photoshop,
more.
we see that the 9700X
Adobe Premiere Pro. Now,
aiming.
this is primarily a single core result. It does benefit from the 3D V cache on the 7800X 3D and here like the 7950X 3D and the super high clock speeds of the 4900K. Oh, this is Baldur's Gate. Adobe Photoshop. What the?
With Baldur's Gate 14600K, it was 2%.
So this is Adobe Premiere Pro. Nope. So Adobe Photoshop 2024. So let's see how the M3 compares here. Adobe Photoshop 2024 M3 Puget benchmark. Puget benchmark for Photoshop. Are there no results? I thought. So 4900K. Does this really not include? Oh, here it is. Mac Pro 2013, Mac Pro 2019. No. Petapixel. Oh yeah, the Petapixel guys. They should have some great tests for it, right? Ports. Do they have benchmarks? The high power setting. That's actually interesting. It's designed to maximize performance in intensive, sustained graphic workflows. Yeah, the fans are allowed to run at higher speeds to increase cooling capacity, which, by the way, you, of course, can also tune that manually with certain apps. So I personally wouldn't even need that. This is Lightroom. No, they didn't run. Oh, Puget Band, Photoshop. Nice. M3 Max MacBook Pro 1523. Now, of course, this is potentially a different like version of it, an older one. Like because this is like a 1-year-old test at this point. But you have Puget Band Photoshop at 1523 here. What? Oh no, this is leveraging the GPU, isn't it? Puget Band Photoshop category Premiere Pro. Puget Bench Premiere Pro. Let's see, are the Premiere Pro benchmarks at least like in the same order of magnitude? Why is these results 10 times higher? I don't want to just say that they're like, oh, like there's another like number here. What the? Why are these results so different? Okay, so apparently you cannot compare these results for some reason. That's disappointing. This is the issue. I wish that like websites like Gamers Nexus and things like that actually like tested stuff like Apple Silicon, because it becomes such a pain in the ass to like look up all those tests to only find that people tested them like on like a completely different version for the Mac that are now show completely incomparable result. Because of course you can see that like it depends on which version of Photoshop you're testing, probably like which different version of Puget Bench you're exactly targeting. So that's unfortunate. Guys, if you know something about this, please let me know. I'll just see if there are any results here. Product publications. Puget Bench for Photoshop. Overall score at 10,000. Wait, can I not search for the actual like M3 Max? It's 11,143. Well, that's nice. That's really nice. Yes, and it's a relatively recent results as well. Yes, it is. Good. So now if we actually go back, oh, it would be somewhere here. So that's where it gets beaten. Now, oh, that's Premiere Pro. I apologize. So now we go back to Photoshop. This is the magic of live streams, guys.
This time,
Man, YouTube sucks ass.
a 600x, which the 9700X overall, but also very disappointing.
There it is. Damn, man. We finally reached it. So it would give you the result of the 7950X getting lightly beaten by the 9700X. So again, a test where it's about even with the 9700X, but the 9700X gives you like 7-8% more single core results in Geekbench. So whenever somebody tells you that like, oh, Geekbench is like the end all be all of like Apple favorable benchmarks, that's simply not true.
When compared to the past.
So we now have this, and now I want the result for Puget Bench for Premiere Pro. No, I don't want to download it. I just want to see the result. Puget Bench for Premiere Pro. And M3 Max delivers you, I don't know what's the difference here, because it just says metal. It doesn't tell you if it's like a CPU or GPU benchmark. I'll just base it on like the context of the other tests there, because 6,000, 9,000, 13,000, those are very, very different results. And what do we have here?
By a 6% margin.
Okay, so I would assume that the 13,000 points are the more relevant ones, because that would put it on about the same level again as the 9700X. So that's actually quite good. Now, of course, this is where the price consideration actually switches around, because I previously praised, of course, like Apple's ability to give you like an M4 that, well, granted, some of this will also be like dependent on single core results, in which points M4 already wins. Some of that will depend on the media encoders, which Apple is usually better than AMD, and Nvidia is usually better than AMD, and Intel is usually better than AMD when it comes to media encoders and decoders. So yeah, it definitely seems like in this result we're also about breaking even. If we actually look more precisely, it would actually beat the 9700X. So once a result that is more favorable towards Apple than just Geekbench. But of course, you still see a generational improvements at least over the 7700X. So if you are very much married to the Windows ecosystem and now you want to save money, because obviously an M3 Max chip is less expensive, it's more expensive than any system you would build with a 9700X, well, that's up to you now. So when it comes to gaming, let's see how it performs.
Though it seems Baldur's Gate 3 wasn't an outlier. Testing with The Last of Us Part 1, we see that the 9700X is actually slower. Yeah, slower than the 7700X.
And you see that the actual considerable difference isn't even between like the average 170 to 175 FPS, but it's in the 1% lows, which go from 120 on the 9700X to 130 on the 7700X, on the previous generation. So this is where we don't see gen-to-gen stagnation, but actually a regression.
By 3% margin. I reran this test multiple times. I tried several different motherboards and memory kits, but one thing remained consistent. For the section of the game that we're testing, the 9700X was slower than the 7700X, so that is very poor performance. Moving on to Cyberpunk 2077, Phantom Liberty.
And by the way, we did get like a side grade generation from Apple to a degree with the M3 Pro when it comes to the GPU, right? It had less memory bandwidth than the M2 Pro from 200 gigabits per second to 150. And it went from 19 max GPU cores down to 18. Now, those GPU cores, though, were higher clocked. They were of a new architecture that supported hardware accelerated ray tracing and mass shading. So while they were about even in rasterization, they were faster in basically everything else. And of course, the CPU, this is where we got another side grade where we moved from an 8+2 M2 Pro chip. Was M2 Pro 8+2 or was it 8+4? It was 8+4. It was 8+4. Apple M2 Pro. I just don't want to say anything wrong. That's just wiki. It's 5 nanometer. The GPU 16 or 19 cores. And it has 4 efficiency cores rather than 2, which was the case on the M1 Pro. So we went from 8 performance cores and 4 efficiency cores to 6 performance cores and 6 efficiency cores. But on the M3 Pro, but the M3 Pro did have much faster cores, both across performance and efficiency cores. So in multi-threading, they're about even out. But on single core, it of course beat the M2 generation quite handily. So again, Apple does sometimes do a slightly disappointing upgrades, but never, especially when there was a 2-year gap in between. The M2 Pro and M2 Max, MacBook Pros, actually came out early in the same year where the M3, 2023, where the M3 Pro and M3 Max came out at the end of the year. So that's half the gap that we got between the 7700X and the 9700X, and you still got a more impressive generational uplift.
The 9700X is at least faster than the 7700X here by a few frames, so a mere 2% improvement. And that is a disappointing improvement for sure. But as I said, at least it's faster in this example. Performance in Hogwarts Legacy is much the same.
Yeah, so we see a lot of stagnation. Then we see some tests where it's imperceptibly faster, like the 7700X still, but like Starfield seems to be really, really bad for this current generation. But again, you probably wouldn't feel it. It just would feel bad to buy a chip that is newer, that is worse. But then, of course, it does win in other games. My God, why is it so difficult to actually find those games? Counter-Strike, it loses in Counter-Strike too. Assetto Corsa Competizione, this is where it wins. Mario and Luigi drive the... Oh, this is Spider-Man. Jesus, you cannot click on anything here on YouTube. You can see, right? I put my mouse over here. It says Assetto Corsa Competizione, and it opens Homeworld 3. So the two things, Hogwarts Legacy, Spider-Man... Wait, this is Spider-Man Remastered. Okay, I think their thumbnails are just their timeline is just wrong. Okay, so it might not actually be YouTube's fault. It might just be Hardware and Box's fault. But sometimes YouTube does like to mix up timestamps that were actually correctly put. Maybe they just didn't put in like them correctly. No, this would make it. So let's say Counter-Strike.
Quality settings are a different setting.
Okay, yeah, they just did it wrong. Okay, that's good to know. Maximum effort. A game like Hitman, basically running the same, very, very slightly faster. This is the kind of thing that you would get if you like gave the 7700X a little bit more performance. And again, I know with PBO you could probably get this to run faster still, but again, manual tuning, having now to consider that it will not consume less power than the previous generation. So yeah, quite disappointing. 13 game average here, basically the same, actually pretty much the same when it comes to 1% lows. slightly faster in averages. You can actually see here where the 7800X 3D absolutely demolishes them. And again, this is a chip that has been on the market now for quite a while. It actually is more efficient than the 7700X. After price cuts, it is also very price comparable to the 9700X. So the only advantage the 9700X would have, that it has higher max clock speeds. So in some multi-threaded pro apps, it will be faster than the 7800X 3D. When it comes to gaming, the 7800X 3D will demolish it. And this is why it's so disappointing that AMD didn't launch the 9800X 3D at the same time as they did the 9700X and the 9600X. Yeah, so final thoughts. Let's hear from Steve very quickly.
$190 US asking price as the 7700X. Yeah, I guess sure, that's fine. It's a small upgrade, nothing to get excited about. It certainly would be bad, or it'd be a lot less bad, but at a 24% premium, AMD can just keep this thing. I have no interest in the 9700X at this point in time.
Yep, that's basically my consideration as well right now. And I know that some people will say, well, how dare you attack the value proposition of AMD? You Apple bootlicking shill, you buy anything they put out anyway. Well, Apple puts out final products. You can take them or leave them. And of course, you can take or leave an individual AMD CPU or GPU. But when you make single purpose devices and you make individual components that go into a product, this is where you have to be open to far more cutthroat competition, because it will run the same Windows as an Intel chip. Now, it might be a lot more reliable, but that's a different discussion for another day. Intel's implosion and their 30% stock drop, that's a story for another day. But you cannot 2 years later launch a chip that is barely any better, just like say, oh, you can give it more power or you can enjoy its higher efficiency. At that point, you could also make similar points about the previous generation. And now your entire point is basically, well, we went from 5 nanometer to N4P. Right, so and that's definitely not exciting. It wasn't very exciting when Apple went from the A15 to the A16, going from N5P to N4, but that was from 1 year to the next. And again, you didn't buy the A16 in isolation. You bought it as part of the iPhone 14 Pro, 14 Pro Max, and of course with all the camera changes, display improvements, all that stuff. And this is the kind of luxury that AMD cannot afford when they put out a chip 2 years later, still on almost the same nodes, with slight improvements. And then you just basically confuse customers with like, is it actually faster? How much more efficient is it actually once you leverage more performance? And that's the kind of thing I, as a consumer, really don't like. I actually really like the Zen 4 launch. I had a lot of hope for Zen 5, but unfortunately, they kind of messed it up, even if the chips themselves aren't actually bad. But if you ever ask yourself, why are these chips, after all the inflation and stuff like that, 20% cheaper than the previous generation was at MSRP? Well, that's why, because the launch is kind of messed up. Now, that concludes sort of my AMD portion of this video. There isn't actually that much more that I would cover here, because we've already talked about why I'm even putting it into the context of even more of the M4 rather than the M3. Of course, DM4 is already on the iPad Pro, but according to Mark Gurman, Apple will upgrade the MacBook Pro, the Mac Mini, and the iMac all this year with the M4 chip. Following will be moved to Jamie Ibrahim joining the chat, saying Mark Gurman just released some news about the M4, M4 Pro, Mac Mini about 30 minutes ago. Well, I'll be damned. What did my buddy Mark Gurman say? Apple preparing major Mac Mini redesign for later this year, report says. Can I open this in Bloomberg? Because sometimes Bloomberg's website is just an absolute mess. Ugh, Jesus Christ. Let's see the write-up here, and then we'll check on the one on Mac Rumors. Mac Mini refresh coming soon. The new Mac Mini will be available in two configurations, one with the M4 chip and one with the M4 Pro chip. Apple has reportedly tested models with at least 3 USB-C ports on the back, alongside the power cable and an HDMI port. The M4 Pro version of the Mac Mini will also be configurable with more RAM and more powerful graphics. Well, yeah, that makes sense. It would just start with the binned version. The report explains that while the new Mac Mini's overall footprint will be smaller, it could be taller than the current model, which measures 1.4 inches high. Here are the current dimensions of the Apple TV 4K: 1.2 inches high, 3.6 inches wide, and 3.6 inches deep. Yeah, it's a square. And then the Mac Mini, which is also a square, is basically double in width and in depth of the Apple TV. But it could be basically maybe that gets reduced to like 6 inches something, but it then gets taller than the 1.4 inches here. People involved in the development of the new Mac Mini say it's essentially an iPad Pro in a small box. Okay, let's do some research. Apple.com, Mac. Go to Mac Mini. The current one is M2 powered. Go to tech specs. There should be. And we see, of course, we have 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports. This is on the M2 version. That would actually line up with our idea that the M4 chip has doubled the number of Thunderbolt controllers. So it could potentially give us either Thunderbolt 5 or extra Thunderbolt ports. So that would be nice. Maybe it would give us faster HDMI as well, because I believe the base Mac Mini doesn't have like. Does the Mac Mini have HDMI 2.1 port? HDMI? No, it doesn't. Where is video output? Video output. Video output. No, I think it has HDMI 2. Thunderbolt, those are. It doesn't say it here, because usually if it would be HDMI 2.1, Apple would just say that it supports like 4K at 120 or something like that. Does Mac Mini have HDMI 2.1? The HDMI port is now HDMI 2.0. No, that's. The M2 Mini only supports 60 Hz. The M2 Pro Mini will do 144 Hz with the or up to 240 over HDMI 2.1. Okay, so the Pro has HDMI 2.1, but not the base Mac Mini. That's interesting. But yeah, you can see that Apple might consider like getting rid of like Ethernet and like USB-A maybe even of the headphone jack for like the base model or something like that, and just give us more Thunderbolt ports, maybe then by default also faster HDMI for the base version. I think that would make sense. Like I know some people still like their USB-As, but yeah, by the way, thank you, Jamie, for pointing this out. And by the way, guys, we've been streaming for about 1.5 hours. I just want to remind you briefly again that if you are enjoying this, please consider subscribing to the channel, liking the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it. And of course, please consider like commenting. Wait, is my stream working? Guys, I briefly need an okay sign from you that my stream is working, because my iPad seems to have issues loading it, but it might just be that like my 5G turned bad or something like that. Let me just briefly check it out. I hate panic when it comes to stuff. Yeah, I think it's just my iPad internet. It's working for me, guys. Let me know if it's all working all right for you, okay? And I'll return to the Mac here. Jamie's all again helping out, saying it's working for you. That's great to hear. Thank you again. The current Mac Mini starts at $599. While the new model may be cheaper to make, it's unclear if the company will pass along any savings to the consumer. I assume it's much more likely that it would still be $599, but maybe it goes to 12 gigs of RAM instead of 8. I think that would be like the value return that Apple gives you for like taking away a few ports and making it slightly smaller. The Mac Mini is currently available in M2 and M2 Pro configs and was last updated at the beginning of 2022. And you will definitely see that Apple gives you a nicer 2-year update than AMD does. At least we already know how the M4 will perform. We can guesstimate how the M4 Pro and the M4 Max will perform. So that's quite nice. So basically what we can expect is maybe like a higher, like a taller Mac Mini, but one that has a slightly smaller footprint, maybe a little closer to the Apple TV, but not quite that small. And with active cooling, you of course would still make it able to perform indefinitely. One thing that isn't here pointed out, if there would be any difference between the M4 Pro Mac Mini and the regular M4 Mac Mini. I don't think that would make too much sense just logistically, but maybe Apple just like doubles down on the efficiency, slims down the power supply, because the power supply in the current Mac Mini is even overkill for the M2 Pro, much less the base M2. So that would be, I believe, quite interesting. If it still starts at $599, I would definitely expect it to also come with the Bint M4, which is not the full 10-core CPU, but like 3 performance and 6 efficiency cores. Maybe Apple has bad enough yields to also have some M3s, some M4s that also have its GPU bint, but of course that will remain to be seen. So thank you, Jamie. That obviously builds upon the previous rumor we covered, which is that did I close this? Yeah, that all Macs would be like basically all major Mac families will get the M4, and in fact most of them will even get it this year. Well, now we know much more about the Mac Mini. Supposedly the MacBook Air and supposedly the MacBook Pro would then get it this year as well. I would assume the MacBook Air then gets updated next year, like in time for the back to school season or something like that. And the iMac would be very interesting, because the iMac skipped famously the M2 chip and jumped from the M1 to the M3. And then according to Mark Gurman, the MacBook Air, the Mac Pro, and the Mac Studio would get updated in 2025. It's interesting because this suggests that, of course, especially now with the Mac Mini, that it would also have launch with the M4 Pro version. That makes it very likely that we would get like all 3 M4 versions, like the M4, M4 Pro, and M4 Max, which of course would power the MacBook Pro simultaneously. Then the Mac Mini has M4 and M4 Pro, and the iMac currently only has the base M3. like no Pro or Max variants, but maybe this year Apple improves cooling or something like that and offers like an M4 Pro. Maybe there like a rumor, a potential iMac Pro also comes true, and we somehow get one with an M4 Max, but that's unlikely. We've heard, of course, rumors that the Mac Pro, Mac Studio would get the Ultra chip somewhere in the second half of next year. That wouldn't be very good, in my opinion. I think Apple should become much more consistent and more aggressive in updating their desktop designs, but it just seems that they were not happy with N3B. They probably didn't like building too many big cores, big chips on N3B. So they just said, oh, F it, let's ignore the Mac Studio, let's ignore the Mac Pro for the M3 generation. Just wait until it's all on M4. And maybe after that, they get to like a fully consistent schedule where all Macs get all chips year to year to year, maybe like every 18 months or something like that. That would be quite interesting, but unfortunately the Mac updates have thus far been less regular than, for example, the iPhone update schedule, which is obviously every new year there's a new iPhone, every new year there's also a new A series processor, and let's see if we can get to that with the M series of chips. Now, it should be noted that we're actually very close to that overall, and that's because obviously the M1 launched in 2020, in very, very late 2020, and now in mid 2024 we are on the M4. So it's almost at the same regularity as the A series chips, a little bit behind. So don't actually think that Apple is just completely ignoring M series chips in comparison to A series. If anything gets neglected by Apple, it's these two devices, the Mac Pro and the Mac Studio, because unlike the Mac Mini, which which is also a desktop, but its main focus is like its efficiency, its small form factor, and its high value, while these devices are more designed to be performance kings. So it's actually quite sad that these devices do not get updates as regularly as the rest. But that's at least my impression. So the last rumor I wanted to cover is that, of course, last shout out to a rumor that I just briefly checked is that the iPhone 16 production is like ramping up. Supposedly, like there are like 90 million devices that Apple plans to sell across the iPhone 16 family this year, and for that they're also building like way over 100 million OLED panels across Samsung and LG, because obviously those screens will be used for the devices being sold across the entire iPhone 16 life cycle. So production is apparently ramping up. And speaking of OLED screens, there is a new rumor that iPad Air and iPad Mini will get OLED as early as 2026. For a while, we actually had the rumor that these devices could get OLED before the iPad Pro. Obviously, that didn't happen. iPad Pro got the tandem OLED screen, which is very, very impressive and a very big reason why a lot of people right now buying iPads are favoring the M4 iPad Pro over the cheaper M2 iPad Air. And now Apple is going to remedy at least some of the inferiority of those cheaper iPads with OLED panels as well. Now, they are single stack designs, not double stack or tandem OLED. So it would be cheaper to make, but they wouldn't be able to reach like the impressive brightness levels that Apple advertises for like the M4, nor would it be quite as efficient. Whether or not Apple manages to also compensate for some of the longevity issues that we have with larger OLEDs remains to be seen. Maybe this new generation, if it's built on like M14 materials, similar to what we are getting with the next iPhone Pro, maybe that will help with longevity overall. Consider that these devices are like launching in 2 years. So Following the iPhone OLED's pattern, that's true, where the iPhone 10 obviously got OLED first, and then it took up until the iPhone 12 for the cheaper iPhones to get OLED. That's also when those iPads got more expensive, by the way. Now, when it comes to ProMotion, we don't know. Apple has been very stingy when it comes to offering ProMotion to other devices. However, they will be giving iPhone, like non-Pro iPhones, ProMotion next year, and those iPads are launching a year after that. So maybe they already have ProMotion. Maybe a generation of those new OLED panels will be without ProMotion, and then an update in 2027 will then finally get ProMotion. But we don't know. What we are seeing here is supposedly the adoption of OLED across more iPads, and that's something I definitely approve of. I've historically said that I do like the color reproduction of regular LCD or mini LED, but overall I do prefer OLED for its perfect blacks and for its faster response times. That's about it for this video. We've obviously talked a lot about Zen 5. Maybe I'll talk about it some more in future videos. Thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for making this a lively video. Thank you for sticking with me, even as I did some extra research on the site across like processors and stuff like that. I hope it was interesting. Let me know what you would like to see me cover sometime next week, because as I said in the beginning, I will be going on a small weekend trip starting tomorrow. Yeah, and beyond that, do all the YouTube jazz, as I call it. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, share it out to anybody who you think might enjoy it, leave a comment, and of course, if you want to support this channel directly, leave a super chat or a super sticker whenever you catch me live. Any small donation is appreciated. I put it right back into the channel. But of course, you can also support this channel directly in the long term through Patreon. Link for that is in the description of this channel, or by becoming a YouTube channel member. Any support is appreciated, be it directly or indirectly. I just love interacting with you guys. Thank you for growing our community. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for showing interest. I'll see you guys next time. This is Mark Tech, tuning out.